Someone said, and I'm sure this is true, I see this over and over again, that if you ask a question, when you get the answer to the question, it raises 3 more questions. So it's not, science isn't like, I ask a question, I find the answer, I go away. Science is kind of like an amoeba. I ask a question, I get some answers. It raises new questions. I go wandering off to answer those questions. In the process of answering those questions, I may disprove what I thought was right in the first place. But I think it would be self-destructive to say, as we're supposed to, challenge everything, including your own information. You have to kind of accept it as the best it can be so far, and then go wandering off into another idea.
And welcome to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It is Luciano as your host speaking. If you're new to the program, if you're a new listener to the program, please check us out at behindgreatness.org. Do share with your family and friends. This is how we're growing. Please rate us too if you have a few minutes to spare or the time it takes to click. By all means, we would welcome it. We also take donations as we are a registered charity. So again, it's just behindgreatness.org, and you'll see the steps to take there. We do this out of love to explore, and as it says on our website, to ask the what ifs and the why nots. And so we speak to people all over the world, as our listeners know, with varied backgrounds to explore what they know and what they don't know. Today we have Dr. Jennifer Mather. She is joining us from the University of Lethbridge, which is in southern Alberta. So it's a western province in Canada for non-Canadian listeners. I'm going to read her bio very quickly, done in the first person. We're going to try this out. I grew up in Victoria, BC. It's on the edge of the ocean, and I was often at the seashore or on it. I was fascinated with sea animals and decided in my teens that I would like to study them. I collected shells, so I thought I'd study mollusks. And I knew I wanted to study what the whole animal was doing out there in the ocean. As an undergraduate at the University of British Columbia, I studied animal behavior and decided that that's what I wanted to do, and chose octopuses because they were the most intelligent and interesting mollusk. Studying them took me to Florida and Boston for graduate work and being a professor at University of Lethbridge. Starting in 1985, I always loved fieldwork, and over the years, I've studied octopuses and squid in Bermuda, Hawaii, Bonaire, in the Caribbean, Brazil, Okinawa, and Moorea, which is an island next door to Tahiti. I did lab work with Roland Anderson at the Seattle Aquarium for 25 years, and lately I have gotten interested also in the welfare of my animals because these intelligent and sensitive creatures are often not protected and cared for because they are quote unquote lowly invertebrates. Welcome to the program, Jennifer.
Thank you.
How did that read? How did your first person bio read? How did it sound to you?
Well, it sounds as if that's what happened. Sometimes it feels inevitable, but it really wasn't inevitable. It was just something that I wanted to do and I kept doing.
Maybe it was inevitable, Jennifer.
And I sometimes tell my students when they are looking at their future that they should not take me as a role model, because most people have 4 or 5 separate careers, and I've only had the one. Mind you, I would argue that this particular one career melts into several because there's teaching and there's research and there's service.
We just had an episode air recently with a fellow named Alan Sabry. And we talked about careers, how the modern human being, especially here in the Western world, needs to specialize in one career in order to make something out of it. And he made the argument. Actually, he presented the argument, didn't make the argument because it's not a new one, about how having different careers like soldier, lawyer, politician, farmer could be more possible for human beings 50, 60, 100 years ago than it is now in concentrated populations.
Well, one of the reasons for that is that we live a long life.
Also a good point.
Okay. So if you were at the dawn of our species, you might make it out of your 20s, in which case you wouldn't have any chance for specialization. But the mean lifespan for women in Canada right now is 83. We have time. And sometimes I try to tell my students this when I say, oh, well, what am I going to do for graduate school? When I need to be prepared, help. And I say, well, you've got another 50 years. It's okay.
Yeah, well, that's another point that we make in this podcast. We're always in a rush to do things to get to the next step, and we're in our 20s. We need to slow down and listen to ourselves as well, I think, too. But here I am speaking to a biologist to just give us a lesson on maybe that's why it is what it is. But so we reached out to you, Jennifer. You may know this because we spoke first back 6 months ago, and then the last time you and I spoke was 4 months ago. So you may not remember, but we first reached out to you because we came across her name in a long article in the Globe and Mail, which is a national newspaper here, about My Octopus Teacher. Right. Or sorry, octopuses. But it was written because that film, that documentary that came out on Netflix 2 years ago, obviously created ripples and interest in octopuses. And then you were quoted in it as an expert in octopuses and one of the few experts in octopuses on the continent. I don't know if it's the world, but at least on the continent. And there is something that you said there that caught my eye. And as usual, when something catches our eye, we have to reach out. So you said the octopuses live their whole lives on the edge between curiosity and fear.
Yes, I still think that's true.
Is that a lesson? So number one, what does that mean? So let's go into it a little bit. And number two, is that a lesson for us at all? Is there a lesson in it?
Well, I will start talking and I will think about that question. And maybe I'll come to a conclusion at the end of talking, and maybe I won't. Okay.
At the end of talking. We only have 45 minutes here. Okay, let's go.
But you see, what the octopus has done is the octopus has left the protective shell. And I hate to say it that way because it suggests an octopus picking up a shell and dropping it in the landscape, which is clearly not what's going on. It takes a fair millennia of evolution. But without protection, it's got to live by its wits. And without protection, it's like one of my colleagues said, a nice unprotected package of protein. And so it's got a fair number of specialist predators who want to get it and a whole bunch of generalists. So if you're a fish of the right size, octopus would be a nice snack, period. Mm-hmm. So the octopus does have to worry about everything. But the other thing is that most of them are in a complex and changing environment. And so their way of living by their wits means they have to consistently find out what's going on around them and update. And actually, recently, I got interested in a general idea in this balance between exploration, learning about the environment, and exploitation, using it.
When we spoke last, you also mentioned something, or you gave me a wonderful quote that I didn't think about, that I intuitively understood and knew, I guess, as a kid and as a teen, as a young adult, interested in animals in general. Although I never took your path. I didn't think I was capable, which is probably another podcast. But anyway, you said about octopuses, you said not knowing something for an octopus is not good. They avoid not knowing and getting the information from the world and not using it. Exploration, like I'm repeating your words just now, exploration versus exploitation, the kind of balance that they make.
Yes, and I think, let's put it this way, in order to be driven to explore, you must be somehow or other unhappy with not knowing. And I don't know what unhappy means. And if I said, do I think octopuses are happy or unhappy, I'd say no. So maybe I should say uncomfortable. And yet there isn't really a good word for it.
That's a great word. So thank you for saying unhappy, because my question to you is, I know you've studied this as well, but this is what got me really curious. Are there clues? Are there clues that exist that octopuses have are conscious?
Yes, but ultimately, the only way we know that someone is conscious is if they tell us. That means we don't know about the animals that we have to decide from watching them.
Well, they could only really tell us if they know our language.
That's right. But we can learn an awful lot from behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So if an animal selects a particular circumstance, a particular environment, a particular place over and over, we know there's something good about it. So octopuses not only select shelter to hide in, they simply aren't found where there isn't shelter. Okay, they just don't live, they get picked off. Which is why we have this wonderful example of what they call the coconut carrying octopus that a group of researchers found in Australia, I think, maybe one of the Pacific Islands, where an octopus was setting out to hunt, several of them, not just one. They were setting out to hunt across the sandy mud. And they found halves of coconut shells that had probably been split by somebody in the resort, thrown out. And they picked up these two halves and kind of packed them together, held them under their arms, and wandered across the landscape. And when they got tired, or when they wanted to rest, or when they had something to eat, or whatever, they would pick these two halves out, separate them, climb in them, and close them around it. So they were carrying shelter with them, which has led people to say that octopuses have a theory of the future, that they understand the past and the present and the future as some kind of continuum. Because they must somehow or other have decided to pick up these coconut shells because they were going to need them in the future. And that's very nice.
Speaking as a biologist, or actually speaking as the expert that you are, so I'm not going to be presumptuous to tell you what hat you're putting on. Could we presume that maybe there is memory in the cells that are passed on through the reproduction cycle of that animal that are more apparent, or that is more apparent in an octopus?
I don't think so, but I don't know. By the way, there's a group of people that did, it's not the same study, but it's an equally interesting study with cuttlefish. So they had two kinds of food, one of which was preferred and one of which was not preferred. Okay. And the preferred food was available in the daytime, and the not preferred food was available at night. And the cuttlefish left the non-preferred food if they knew that the preferred food was coming that night. And they ate the non-preferred food if they knew it wasn't coming.
So they understand prediction, or they're acting on predictive behavior.
Gotcha.
Right? Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, just for the listener, because you mentioned cuttlefish. So many listeners might not understand what a cuttlefish. I didn't understand what it was when I first spoke to you. I had to look it up. But you were referring to, so octopus, cuttlefish, squids are all cephalopods.
Gotcha.
And they all have tentacles, although the cuttlefish are smaller.
Arms.
Arms. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Arms. Yeah. Yes.
Octopuses have 8 arms. Cuttlefish and squid have 8 arms and 2 tentacles. The tentacles are very elastic. They have either or suckers and hooks on the club of the tentacle, and they shoot it out to catch prey. Octopuses don't have that. And this is a very casual way to think of it, but I find casual ways interesting sometimes. So if you think about an octopus, if you think about the fact that all these groups have the arms, right? They're different sizes. So a squid is like a torpedo with arms at one end. A cuttlefish is like a blimp with arms at one end. And the octopus is like a plastic bag with great big arms coming out of it.
Love that. I
Well,
love
it gives
that.
you a good analogy. Okay.
Torpedo, blimp, and plastic bag. Wow. um, Speaking of material, actually,
Yes.
I made a note here. Let's quickly give a little bit of context to the listeners, well, 'cause, I thought it was pretty cool. And it spoke to belief systems, I think, too, at least to me personally. Before I hint to the, excuse me, this is part of my hint to the listener. Elizabeth Sartouris, is an evolution biologist, who was on the podcast about a year and a half ago. She had a similar background in desire as a little girl growing up on the East Coast, as did you as a little girl growing up on the West Coast. And you grew up in Victoria, which is the city probably closest to Seattle on the Canadian side of the border, but on an island. So closest to Seattle by water. And you said your dad was very English. He had 2 daughters, you and your sister.
3.
3. I'm going to correct that. So 3 daughters. And you said it was his style to treat the 3 of you like human material, the way he brought you up. Do you remember saying that? Speaking of material?
I don't remember saying it, but I think it's fair. Now, mind you, that was a long time ago.
Yes.
But if you're talking 70 years ago, you're talking about an era in which men paid particular attention to boys and raised them as man material, and women paid particular attention to girls and raised them as woman material. And science is still a male enterprise, but it sure was then. When I went to university as an undergraduate, I was in biology. And I took one of these aptitude tests, and I remember 2 things that the woman said. The first thing she said was, "Don't be a secretary." And I said, "That's okay. I would never be a secretary." But the second thing she said is that I scored fairly high on human values and very high on science values. And she said, "Have you thought of conservation?"
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "No." But there was, at the time, a conservation program. So in my 4th year, I went to the director of this program and said, "I'd like to look into coming into I don't think it was a graduate program, but whatever it was, a training program." And he said, "I can't do that. We don't take girls."
They also said girls can't sleep in tents.
Well, one of the things he said as a rider to that is he said, "We have to go out in the environment and we have to go out in tents. Girls can't do that kind of stuff," which I thought was extremely funny because I was doing it. But when I was younger, I was meek. So I just went away.
When did you unmeek yourself?
Gradually.
Mm.
One doesn't unmeek suddenly, or I don't, most people don't.
Yeah.
To some extent, I think you unmeek as an academic when you get tenure.
Why? What does tenure do?
Because then they can't throw you out for any trivial reason.
Which means you can explore more?
Yes. I don't know if you explore more or you just explore without having to think about the consequences.
Ah, even better. Even better.
But it is gradual. I mean, there's a researcher who was looking at learning based on smell. And he found that the traditional paradigms for visual learning didn't work. But he didn't publish until he had tenure. So this is an example of this kind of thing. But I think it's more usually loosening.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. But it is a common thing that I hear from from academically inclined folks that come into the podcast who admit to the same. But you're the first who use the words exploring finally without the consequences.
What's really interesting to think about is when I first became a scientist, whatever that means. And it's interesting because for a woman in the sciences, I think it takes time to recognize oneself as a scholar. It took me quite a while.
Does it matter to you that you are? Like, is it your identity?
I don't know. If you ask anybody from the age of about 3 up what a scientist looks like, they would say a middle-aged white male with a lab coat. And so that was my image for a long, long, long time. So if you don't fit into the stereotype, it's difficult to admit that you are the stereotype. But the other thing that occurred to me long since is that in some ways, as a scientist, I am allowed to be curious. I'm allowed to retain this kind of outlook that the 5-year-old has. How come? Why? What happens if I do this? I like that.
Well, I think you became a scientist because you allowed yourself to be curious to begin with.
I was encouraged in this, by the way. I have to make that very clear. My mother had a degree in bacteriology, a university degree, and this is definitely not something that happened in the 30s. And my father had a degree from Kindred. I think it was math and economics. So I did grow up in a household where inquiring, thinking, learning, books was encouraged, and that's huge. Because even now, I don't think it's necessarily true for young women, girls.
Well, I think the encouragement of that, I think, is extremely positive. There's no doubt. I think the encouragement to ask questions, regardless of whether your environment has that, is more important. See, the word, use the word allowed. I mean, thank you for using these words too. Allowed and used before exploring and consequences. It becomes very mucky, that conversation. Not our conversation, but that conversation becomes very mucky because it implies that as we grow older from our natural childlike state of curiosity and exploring, that those aren't necessarily important for whatever structures you grow into.
They're squashed.
They're squashed. Another great word. They're squashed.
Okay, so I have an example which I always thought about. I was in my first year at university and I was taking, I think it was English, and I was studying with a friend of mine.
Mm-hmm.
And we were trying to figure out what the prof would put on the exam. And I said, yeah, well, I'm going to study what I think is important. And she said, I'm going to study what I think she thinks is important. Guess who got a higher grade?
You're going to sadden me, but then you're not going to surprise me.
It wasn't me.
Yeah. So as a father of 2 boys who are scientifically inclined, and one of them is just finishing high school, the other one's in university. You know, we have discussions often about exploring things, and obviously I don't have a science background, so I'm very limited to what I know and what I'm trying to explore. That's why I also have you on the podcast and people like you. But anyway, so they understand from their father that to learn and to be curious and to ask questions is number one. Number two, they're in a system that they don't necessarily want to be in, but in order to pole vault, they need to understand how to respond to that system, to leverage it, to then do what they want. That's saddening. It's saddening, but I feel compelled to tell them that.
And I've had discussions with other university professors, with teachers, about how much do we have to have them memorize in order that they can be free to think. You can't be free to think without foundation. And yet we have to worry about how much foundation they must have.
You said that you don't give exams to your students.
Correct.
Why? Or why not?
Well, for one thing, I'm not in first year. I'm not teaching first year. I'm not quite sure what I would do in first year. Okay. So I have third and fourth year students. One of my colleagues once said that the things that we believe are facts probably aren't going to last more than 10 years.
Mm.
And then they're going to be superseded by other facts, which themselves may or may not turn out to be correct. So if I want to teach my students, I don't want to teach them the facts. I want to teach them critical thinking. In fact, what I probably want to do is I want to teach them how to find knowledge and then how to evaluate it.
In a few words, it's a very unfair question, but forgive me. How do you teach to find knowledge?
How do I teach what? To find knowledge.
Yeah.
Books, papers, the internet, conversation, practical experience. There you go.
How do you find new knowledge?
All the same ways. I mean, if you think about it, take a nonfiction book, though a fiction book probably would have some of the same things. By the time knowledge gets into a book in the sciences, it's 5 years old, minimum. Nonetheless, if you're trying to understand an area that you didn't understand before, it'll give you a good foundation. On the other hand, I don't read books in my immediate area because I made the knowledge that appears in the books. I don't need to read them. I read books in other areas, though, for sure. And of course, books that distill the knowledge and think about it and compare it and evaluate it.
Right. So
definitely.
My question then, I guess from that, do you ever look to disprove your own prior knowledge that you've broadcasted? So, I mean, folks and scholars like you broadcast it. So you go find knowledge and new knowledge and you theorize about it and then you broadcast it. Do you ever see that? Are you happy with sitting on that knowledge, or do you challenge it? Do you look to disprove it?
It's a different way of thinking about it, which is fascinating. Okay, I do not set out to disprove what I have proved. But someone said, and I'm sure this is true, I see this over and over again, that if you ask a question, when you get the answer to the question, it raises 3 more questions. So it's not, science isn't like, I ask a question, I find the answer, I go away. Science is kind of like an amoeba. I ask a question, I get some answers. It raises new questions. I go wandering off to answer those questions. In the process of answering those questions, I may disprove what I thought was right in the first place. But I think it would be self-destructive to say, as we're supposed to, challenge everything, including your own information. You have to kind of accept it as the best it can be so far, and then go wandering off into another idea.
So far. We had Thomas Verney on the podcast as well. He's a psychiatrist and he's well into his 80s now. And so he was in a public spotlight back in the 70s and 80s as he specialized in perinatal and prenatal psychiatry. And we've had conversations since. Lovely human being. And he says he's always frustrated with what pushes him, what motivates him is his frustration with not knowing enough.
There's a quote from that one. The more you know, the more you know you don't know.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
what's fun.
But one of the things that we should be thinking about now, and I think it would be interesting to look at someone in their 20s now, because I think that our scientific knowledge was solidly embedded in our culture. And we simply didn't realize there were other cultures' points of view.
Mm.
And so we didn't realize we should be careful about what we accepted as the given truth, because it was the given truth according to our culture. And of course, now we're thinking about ecology. We're beginning to understand ecology in a way that, in some ways, the First Nations knew way before we invaded.
And First Nations are not any different than the First Nations of any other geographical location on the planet. Except the difference is that we, like you and I, people like you and I, who've immigrated to this country over the last, well, let's say this country, I mean, over the last few hundred years, we've all come from a place of indigeneity that has been lost to ourselves. We've lost that memory.
I don't know if we've lost it. Maybe we haven't acquired it. But it's not automatically true that any quote unquote primitive culture is nurtured. If you look at what we call them native Hawaiians now, but the Hawaiians who settled on the islands, they actually exterminated a lot of the species. Then we came along, of course, and exterminated a whole bunch of the rest. But I don't think you can automatically say a quote unquote primitive culture is better than our culture. What you have to say is look at it through the viewpoint of your culture first, then start looking at it through the viewpoint of other cultures and see what you can find in the long run.
Yeah, well, so I agree with you, and I don't believe one is better over the other, because I think that's self-defeating. You're not open to learning if you use that language. So I'm with you on that. And I think it's wisdom. When you ignore wisdom in another, you are ignoring. You are not actively trying to find knowledge.
But you may not know. That's the problem.
You may not know.
Yeah.
You may not know what. I'm sorry, I lost you.
Well, I don't know why I keep thinking of cute little analogies like this, but there's the story of a man who came out to the parking lot, and there was a guy who was drunk, and he was looking for his car keys. Okay. And he dropped his car keys. And he was overlooking for the car keys underneath the light of the parking lot. And eventually the guy who was trying to help him said, "Are you sure you dropped them here?" And the drunk said, "No, I'm not sure, but there's light, I can see it." So you may be looking, and that's another thing we have to try to work on, by God, which is we should try not to set up studies that will find what we expect to find.
Yeah, because you're not trying to find knowledge when you do that.
Yeah. But in a way, that's what the ethologist is good for. And my early training was in ethology, because the ethology is basically an observer of behavior.
Well, right, and that's what drove you. I think you told me this before. I might be misquoting you. I'm going to paraphrase because I can't find a note here. But you were less interested in understanding the cell structure of a biological entity and more about how it behaved. You like to observe them.
Well, I was interested in the whole animal, which is not the same thing as ethology. Okay. And I was interested in the whole animal because I thought that the whole was more than the sum of the parts. And at that time, I think when I first started studying animal behavior, I didn't at all know that this was a wise thing to do. Interestingly enough, I also have a background in human perception. And in human perception, it's not just that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. The whole may be different from the sum of the parts.
Oh, you just fired up another cylinder there for me.
Okay, I can do this quite quickly, and then we probably are going to have to quit.
Yeah, but I have one more question, two more questions for you.
Okay, if you see lights in, let's say, a fast food place or something, and you see a light moving, right? What it probably is a light here and 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 a light here. But this one illuminates, and then this one illuminates, and then this one illuminates, and this one illuminates. And what you perceive is one moving. And it's different from the pieces.
Wow. Metaphysically speaking, that can, I mean, we can.
Perceptually.
Yes, but that has like there's a parallel discussion there metaphysically as well. That's wonderful.
Yes, of course. I mean, there's a lovely discussion about we construct the world around us. We do not receive it. And I was explaining this to somebody because I said, well, cephalopods cannot perceive color. And he said, you mean they're limited? And I said, yes, but so are we. So the cephalopod perceives a dimension of the visual stimulus, the plane of polarization. We perceive a dimension of the stimulus, wavelength. We can do one, they can do the other.
The Canadian Astronomical Society invited you to a Zoom conference. You told me this is so fascinating, to discuss on whether octopuses may have come from space, whether they are aliens.
Yes.
The Astronomical Society. Very quickly, what did you find in that conversation, or what was your experience with that conversation? And did you agree with that? I guess.
Well, the problem was a simple one. It was a group of cosmologists. And the cosmologist is always looking for the different. It's always looking for what's out there in space. Mm-hmm. And while I don't know exactly what the background was of this group, they clearly didn't have a lot of biological background. So they said, well, the social learning hypothesis is that we develop intelligence from group membership. And octopuses don't do that, they're solitary. So they're not related to mammals. So in order to get this quality, which we think mammals are the only ones who have, it must have come from someplace else. So they must have come as, believe it or not, frozen eggs in the equivalent of comets. Well, I'm a scientist. So I looked at that and I thought, come on. In fact, a lot of my friends, when I tell them that, they have a good chuckle. For one thing, they didn't look at the evolutionary relationship and background of the octopus. Because if you say that, you would have to say, well, they're not a mollusk. They must have somehow or other come from someplace, okay? And if you look at it, there's a few characteristics that mollusks nearly all have. One of them is hemocyanin in the blood instead of hemoglobin, which we have. And they've got hemocyanin, so they're related to the other mollusks. The other thing is a ribbon of teeth called the radula, which the octopuses have and other mollusks have. But the other thing is that they made this argument that there was a discontinuity in the fossil record. That you have the nautiluses with their shell, and there's lots and lots and lots of them, particular ages and areas, in fact, are named for nautiloids or ammonoids. And then they said, but they'd stopped being there in the fossil record. So they must have come from space. Yeah, but they didn't have a shell anymore. And what is it that gets preserved in the fossil record? Shells and bones. Right. What is it doesn't get preserved in the fossil record? Soft tissue.
you can understand in human psychology, like, again, I'm not speaking as a pro on anything here, just somebody who's thought about this at times, that the octopus is such a strangely behaved, eerily similar in intelligence to what we think is intelligent, like ourselves. So we see ourselves in it, but so much more capable that it could be frightening to come up against an octopus that might be able to live on land and be as large or larger than us. Like that, that is frightening.
Well, you're safe with that one. And you can actually go back to the hemocyanin, okay? Because both hemocyanin and hemoglobin are oxygen-carrying molecules. And hemocyanin doesn't bind as well to oxygen as hemoglobin. So the octopus and the squid, maybe particularly the squid, have pushed the physiology of the mollusks, but as far as the physiology of the cephalopods, but as far as they're going to be able to go. So they're not going to come on land because they're not physiologically capable. We're safe.
Yes,
Okay.
but what if?
On the other hand, yes, and science fiction people have wonderful time with what if. But I want to say this because I think it's really, really important. We call them aliens because they're so different from us. Oh, come on, guys. Think of honeybees. They are also so different from us. Think of, I was going to say starfish, but we really call them sea stars to make it clear they're not fish. They are really fascinating animals. They have no brain, but they have nicely directed behavior in a way that seems to be consensual and we don't understand. So what we have to do is just completely get rid of saying the human model is the important model of the animal in the planet. What we have to say is, gee, they're different. Yeah, but an octopus is a perfectly reasonable octopus, just as you are a perfectly reasonable human being. And just as the bumblebees that are hibernating in my garden are perfectly reasonable bumblebees. And I think I can end with that. Yes?
Well, we're going to end with one more. Actually, we're not going to talk about the talking parrot that you told me about and Irene Pepperberg. Maybe we'll save that for another conversation about animals that can understand language, maybe communicate something to you very eerily. We'll leave that as a hint. So last question, I guess, then, since you insist on it. What is greatness to you?
Influence and wisdom.
Why do you say influence?
Because the wisdom that is not spread doesn't make you great.
Let's leave it on that note. Thank you, Jennifer, so much.
But it's interesting because I am writing a book, but that's beside the point. You can ask me about that sometime in the future. But I found that if I look into a small area that fascinates me, that people know about, I very often find somebody who is the person that you would go talk to if you wanted to understand this group of animals or this particular function. And in that sense, I'm supposed to be the person who knows about cephalopod behavior. But I haven't any influence. And if I did, I don't know what it would get me. Gandhi is great.
Well, don't shortchange yourself, because you did say something that was quoted in a national newspaper that some random guy in Toronto picked up, read, and said, wow, I want to talk to her, and then had a public conversation with her. Guess what's broadcasted today? Your wisdom.
The flip side of that, because I don't agree with you, but that's beside the point.
Yeah, okay. Sure, of course.
Is that you never know who's listening. And that is humbling but encouraging.
Let's leave it on that note, Jennifer. Okay. Thank you. Great conversation. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today, there's more to come. Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and learn about our live events at inspirenorth.com. You'll also find links to our social media right on our website, so be sure to give us a like and follow. Until next time, stay inspired.